The letter was not meant for her eyes. Honoria Trent knew this the moment her gaze fell upon the broken wax seal. Her father's private correspondence scattered carelessly across his writing desk, as though he had fled the room mid-thought. She had only entered the library to retrieve a volume of sonnets. She had only meant to stay a moment. And yet, as the cold October draught pushed through the cracked window and made the candle on the mantel bow and tremble, she found she could not look away. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, the kind of script that did not ask, it commanded. "You have until the 1st of November, Trent, the full sum, or I shall take what is owed me in another form entirely." It was signed by a single name, no title, no pleasantry, simply Blackwell. Honoria's fingers had gone cold before she reached the second line. She was not a foolish woman. At 22, she had managed her father's household since her mother's passing, had kept the accounts, had smiled through 3 consecutive seasons without securing a match, not for want of offers, but for want of any offer that did not make her feel as though she were being purchased rather than courted. She understood, better than most young women of her station, the cruel arithmetic of a family's financial precarity. But nothing, not 3 years of quiet ledger-keeping, not the whispered anxieties she had caught between her father and his solicitor, nothing had prepared her for the number she saw on that page. It was obscene, it was ruinous, it was the kind of debt that did not merely embarrass a family, it erased one. She was still standing there, the letter clutched against the bodice of her pale muslin gown, when her father appeared in the doorway. Viscount Trent was a handsome man turned grey at the temples before his time. He had his daughter's same dark eyes, earnest, perceptive, but tonight those eyes were stripped of every pretense. He looked at her, he looked at the letter in her hands, and then, with the slow, terrible dignity of a man who has nothing left to shield himself with, he crossed the room and sank into the leather chair beside the cold hearth. He said nothing for a long moment. The candle continued to flinch in the draught. "How much of it have you read?" asked at last. "Enough," Honoria said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Papa, who is Blackwell?" Her father closed his eyes. "Piers Blackwell, the Duke of Ashgate." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of dread moved outward from it in every direction. Honoria had heard of the Duke of Ashgate. Every family in Mayfair had heard of the Duke of Ashgate. He was not a man discussed in admiration at dinner parties. He was a man discussed in hushed tones near doorways, a dark fixture of drawing-room rumour, a war-hardened peer of terrifying reputation, who, by most accounts, had emerged from the continent not only alive, but fundamentally altered, harder, colder, and utterly devoid of patience for the social niceties that govern civilized life. "How long?" she whispered. 2 years, her father admitted. "It began as sport, a few card games. I thought, Honoria, I truly believed I could recover the losses before—" He stopped. The sentence collapsed under its own weight. "I have failed you. I have failed your brother. I have failed your mother's memory, God rest her." The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a house that already knew its walls were condemned. Honoria set the letter down upon the desk with great care, as though it were a living thing capable of further harm. She pressed her palms flat against the cool surface of the mahogany and breathed. "Is there nothing to be sold? The hunting lodge in—" "Gone," her father said, "mortgaged against the original debt 18 months ago. The Dorset property, entailed. I cannot touch it without your brother reaching his majority, and Rufus is 12 years old." The draught moved again. The candle flame shivered, elongated, and nearly went out. "Then we are finished," she said, not with grief, with the flat, unsentimental clarity of a woman whose mind had already begun to calculate. "There is one possibility," her father said. His voice had dropped so low she had to lean forward to hear him.
Blackwell himself proposed it, through his solicitor, 3 days ago. Honoria waited. He will dissolve the debt entirely, every penny, no scandal, no creditors at the door, no whisper of this reaching the papers. Her father finally lifted his eyes to hers. They were devastated. In exchange for your hand in marriage. The room did not spin. Honoria had always prided herself on the steadiness of her constitution, but the blood that drained from her cheeks in that moment left her feeling hollowed, like a portrait from which someone had quietly removed the canvas, leaving only the frame. "He does not know me," she said. "No." "He has never met me." "No." "Then this is not a proposal," and she was surprised by the cold precision in her own voice. "It is an acquisition." Her father said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She thought of her brother, slight, bookish Rufus, who collected beetles and recited Latin verses at breakfast, and had not the faintest comprehension of the catastrophe gathering around him. She thought of the house, the creaking third stair, the rose garden her mother had planted, the library that smelled of beeswax and old paper. She thought of what it would mean for a 12-year-old boy to wake one morning and find that his name, his inheritance, his very future had been dissolved by his father's weakness. "When does he expect an answer?" she asked. Her father's voice broke when he replied. "He is calling tomorrow afternoon." Piers Blackwell, Duke of Ashgate, arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, which told Honoria immediately that he was a man who considered punctuality a form of dominance. She received him in the front parlour, the good parlour, with the Wedgwood vases and the painted fire screen, wearing her best day dress of deep blue wool, her dark hair arranged simply at the nape of her neck. She had decided she would not adorn herself elaborately for this meeting. She would not perform. He was buying a practical arrangement, and she intended to present herself as precisely that, practical.
He was taller than she had imagined. He filled the parlor doorway in a way that required the room to renegotiate itself around him. Broad of shoulder, dressed entirely in charcoal grey, his dark hair cropped close, his jaw carrying the particular hard geometry of a man who had spent years in conditions that did not permit softness. His eyes, when they found hers, were an unusual pale grey, the colour of winter sky before snow, and they moved over her face with an assessment so frank, so utterly unadorned by social pretense, that she felt simultaneously affronted and oddly respected. He did not bow immediately. He looked at her for one long, unapologetic moment. Then he inclined his head. "Miss Trent." "Your Grace," she replied, and gestured to the chair across from the settee with the composed grace of a woman who was absolutely not terrified. "Will you sit?" He sat. She sat. The footman withdrew. The fire in the grate breathed quietly between them. "You have read the terms," he said, not a question. "I have." "And you understand them?" "Completely." She folded her hands in her lap with great deliberateness. "I should like to understand one thing more, however, before I give my answer." Something shifted in his expression, the faintest alteration, as though he had expected capitulation and encountered instead a chess opponent. "Ask it," he said. "Why me?" Her voice did not waver. "You are a duke. You could dissolve my father's debt with barely a thought and demand nothing in return. You could purchase a far more advantageous match from any family in England. Why negotiate for a viscount's daughter of no particular fortune and no particular connections?" The silence that followed was considerable. The fire settled. A log shifted. Outside, a carriage passed on the wet street, and the sound of horses faded into the November grey. "Because you have managed your father's household for 3 years, without complaint, without credit, and without error. Because when I make an arrangement, Miss Trent, I do not require beauty or title. I require competence, and I require courage.
He paused. "You are here, are you not? You did not send your father to speak for you. That tells me something." Honoria looked at this dangerous, solitary man, this fortress of a person who had built his walls so high that no warmth could be expected to breach them, and she felt something move inside her chest. Not tenderness, not yet, but the distant precursor of it, recognition, the peculiar awareness of encountering someone who has, in their own completely different fashion, learned to carry weight alone. "I will marry you, on one condition." His brow rose fractionally. "You are in no position to—" "My brother's education, Eton, then Oxford, fully funded, regardless of what passes between us, that is my condition." Another silence. Then, slowly, something moved at the corner of Piers Blackwell's mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the shadow of one, the ghost of an expression that had, perhaps, once lived more freely on that face, before the war, before whatever had made him into this. "Agreed," he said quietly. They were married on a grey Thursday in November at a small church in Mayfair, with only her father and a pair of the Duke's solicitors as witnesses. There were no flowers, there was no wedding breakfast, there was only the cold stone smell of the nave, the vicar's careful voice, and the moment when Piers Blackwell placed a plain gold band upon her finger and held her hand in his, briefly, firmly, before releasing it. She told herself she felt nothing, but his hand had been warm, and in the dead chill of that November morning, warmth, however brief and unbidden, has a way of being remembered. The Duke's carriage was waiting. It was a long road north to Ashgate Manor, and as the London streets fell away behind her, and the countryside opened into bare frost-silvered fields, stretching toward a pale horizon, Honoria Trent, now Honoria Blackwell, Duchess of Ashgate, looked out of the carriage window and made herself a quiet, unspoken promise. She had entered this marriage to save her family from disgrace. She had not entered it to be diminished. She had not entered it to disappear. Whatever awaited her in that cold northern manor, whatever history lived in its stones, whatever silence the Duke had surrounded himself with and called a life, she intended to be present in it, fully, stubbornly, unashamedly. The wheel hit a rut. She swayed. Across the carriage, the Duke reached out instinctively, without thought, and steadied her with one broad hand against her arm. Their eyes met. He withdrew his hand immediately, as though the contact had surprised him as much as it had her, and turned back to the window. But the color had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in those pale grey eyes, and Honoria, for the first time since she had read that letter in the flickering candlelight of her father's library, allowed herself to breathe. Some marriages begin in drawing rooms, with music and flowers and the whole bright ceremony of hope, and some begin in cold churches, born of necessity, sealed with gold and quiet resignation. But do not mistake the beginning for the story. The story, the real and irreversible story, begins the moment two wounded people look at each other and, despite every intention to the contrary, see something worth knowing. This was only the first chapter.